of our hashtags. They are UR22 and UR22LDN. Do put your phones back on silent, but do feel free to tweet or otherwise engage in social media. And of course, you can ask questions both in the room and through the website. And if you scan this on your lanyard, that will give you access. It'll take you straight to the program. I think that's all the information I have to give you for the moment. Now, in this session, we'll explore new findings from the 2021 Lloyd's Register Foundation World Risk Poll on perceptions of risk from AI and personal data misuse. You heard a little bit of that from the audience earlier on. We'll discuss what must be done to manage this new area of risk while still maximising the potential of these innovative technologies to help manage old ones. So, we'll hear from Lloyd's Register Foundation's Director of Evidence and Insight, that's Dr. Sarah Cumbers. Sarah is an advocate of evidence-based policy and practice, and her team works to use data and evidence to help better understand the complex factors that affect safety. This includes driving improvements in the availability, quality, and accessibility of data, synthesis of evidence, and implementation of evidence into practice to improve safety outcomes. Also on our panel today is Aidan Pepin, who is the Public Participation and Research Lead at the Ada Lovelace Institution, an independent research organisation based here in London and also in Brussels, working on issues of data, AI and society. Aidan leads Ada's work to bring public voices and perspectives to debate about data and AI through projects like the Citizens Biometrics Council, which I think we'll hear more about, the first poll of UK public attitudes towards facial recognition technology, and citizens' juries on responsible governance of data during a pandemic. And finally, Shaha Avin. Now, Shaha studies artificial intelligence risks and how to manage them. He's a senior research associate at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, working with others to develop greater understanding and awareness of global catastrophic risks. He has co-led cross-institution reports on the malicious use of AI and trustworthy AI development. So, that's who we have here. Very, very impressive panel, huge subject. We'll start with an overview from Sarah.
Lovely, thank you. I'm going to take to the lectern so I can see my slides. So the use of, is it still working?
I think you need to get a little bit closer.
Is it not coming through this one? It is coming. Okay, thank you. So the use of personal data and artificial intelligence technologies have often been heralded to improve standards of living, productivity, and sometimes they're also claimed to improve inclusion and fairness by presenting a more accurate picture of the world in which we live and removing human biases from decision making. But the past introduction of modern technologies, so take genetically modified food or nuclear power, for example, have taught us that quite often it's not the development of the technology itself that can be the challenge, but it's actually public opinion. And if we don't get it right in managing public opinion and attitudes towards new technologies, then the introduction of these new technologies can stall and falter and essentially lead to a situation where the promised impact of the delivery of these technologies is not received. And I've included a few headlines here of recent stories talking both about the risks and benefits of artificial intelligence and data-driven technologies. So Lloyd's Register Foundation is a global safety charity. We work to invest in education, in research and in innovation programs around the globe to make the world a safer place. And we've created a very unique and novel data set and a very large data set, which gives us a very, very strong level of confidence in its findings, that helps us to understand how people across the world think and feel about artificial intelligence and the use of their data when they're working online. It's called the World Risk Poll, and we're making this data available so that actors within the system, governments, regulators, businesses, researchers, etc., can work to both construct and develop and then implement these technologies in a way that responds to public sentiment. So a little bit of information, background about the World Risk Poll, and you can see here polling undertaken, I think that was back in 2019 in Mongolia. We commissioned the global polling company Gallup to ask a series of questions to people around the world, a random sample in each country, a series of questions about risk and safety. 121 countries in 2021, 125,000 interviews, so that's about 1,000 in each country that were polled, but up to 3,000 in the countries with larger populations. And one of the most important things about the World Risk Poll is that this data is collected in places where little or no official data on risk and safety exists. And so we also polled in 2019, and so our first World Risk Poll report launched in July this year, A Changed World, looked at how risk and perception globally had changed, or perhaps hadn't changed, as you'll find out if you read the report, in the intervening years between 2019 and 2021, obviously COVID being the big factor there globally. And then our second report, A Resilient World, was launched in September this year, looking at the strengths and vulnerabilities of communities around the world from the perspective of their own individual resilience. And then our final report will be launched early in the new year on violence and harassment in the workplace in collaboration with the International Labour Organization. But I'm going to talk to you this morning about the results about artificial intelligence and about the misuse of personal data. And so this first slide here shows the response to the question, do you think that technologies that use artificial intelligence will help or harm people in your country over the next 20 years? And you can see that a large proportion of people, 39% in the green there, said that artificial intelligence would mostly help. However, you can also see that a significant proportion said that they felt that these technologies would harm. So almost 1 in 3 at 28% said that the technology would harm. And you can see that if you combine together the no opinions and the don't knows, the sort of greys and blues and blacks at the bottom, that also adds up to around 30%. So actually, sentiment about artificial intelligence is really quite equally balanced globally. However, that global picture masks really quite significant variation. And this map here shows this gradient of trust across the world. It shows the ratio within each of the individual countries coloured on those who say that artificial intelligence will mostly help versus those who think it will mostly harm. And you can see that in Eastern Asia, where Japan, South Korea, for example, and China as well, are on the very cutting edge of the development and the implementation of these technologies, the attitudes are much more positive, with a ratio of 4.4 there in Eastern Asia, compared to the low-income regions in Africa in particular, Eastern Africa, with a ratio there down at 0.4, so that the darker pink being countries where sentiment is negative. So I mentioned the countries in Eastern Asia that are progressive in the rollout of artificial intelligence, but familiarity with the technology isn't the only thing that's driving perceptions. If you look at North America, over there on the left-hand side in the pale pink with a ratio of 1, America is also a leader in the development of these technologies, and yet actually opinion there it sits on the negative side globally. And just going back to Africa, in Eastern Africa, 51% of people said that these technologies would mostly harm. So a really high level of skepticism there in a number of low-income countries across the world. And what's the challenge associated with those high levels of skepticism? Well, I've already talked about some of the potential benefits that these technologies can bring, and many of you in the room will work in disaster risk management, for example, and will know the benefit of having applications that can be rolled out, early warnings, for example. But if people are not going to trust these systems, then they're not going to derive the potential benefit that they will bring. And so this is a really, really important issue, particularly in low-income countries where people also don't have the access to technology, so they're not getting the familiarity with these systems. So as part of the poll, we also asked about people's perception of the risk of their information being misused online. We asked about whether they thought their information might be stolen, whether it might be used by companies for marketing without their permission, and whether it might be used by government without permission. And you can see in 2 shades of pink there that a huge proportion of people globally are either very worried or somewhat worried about their data being misused in these ways. There's clearly a very significant issue here with the extent to which people globally feel that they can trust the systems where their personal data is being used. And we also asked, as part of the World Risk Poll, about people's experience of discrimination. And this was one of the most interesting questions that we asked on the poll, because when you start to look at the results of other questions against whether people have experienced discrimination, some very interesting, very shocking patterns start to emerge in terms of people's risk and safety experiences and perceptions combined with their experience of discrimination. And so you can see here these 3 series of graphs and the gradients that you see from the green, where people haven't experienced discrimination, through the pink, where they've experienced one form, through to the dark blue, when they've experienced 2 or more forms of discrimination, and these increasing levels of mistrust. That 42% of people who haven't experienced discrimination are worried about their information being stolen online, rising to 54% of people who've experienced 2 or more forms of discrimination. So we also looked at the experience of discrimination against people's concern about artificial intelligence. And we find that at the global level, experience of discrimination very much galvanizes people's opinions about artificial intelligence and the risk of harm. So where people have experienced discrimination, they're less likely to say that they don't have an opinion about these technologies and more likely to say that they will either help or harm. But again, those global statistics mark some very interesting findings at a country level. And we see that in 16 countries globally, the increase in worry about harm from artificial intelligence rose by more than 10 percentage points if an individual had experienced discrimination. And 3 of those countries, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, obviously based in the Nordics, where public perception generally is very, very positive about AI, and people are very positive about the potential of the technology. But if discrimination has been experienced, then that has a very significant impact on the way people feel about these technologies. So again, in terms of key takeaways, there's an issue here with vulnerable groups globally, and that vulnerability really leaving them very mistrustful about technologies that use their personal data. Looking at another aspect of vulnerability, financial vulnerability, we find that income also plays a key role in people's attitudes to the use of personal data. And again, you can see this gradient here of increasing concern. In the green there on the left, 35% of people who are living comfortably on their current income are concerned about the theft of their data online, rising to 56% of people. So a hugely significant increase there, up to 56% of people feeling concerned about the theft of their personal data if they're finding it difficult to get by on their current income. And so this trend that we see of increasing concern with decreasing disposable income is also seen for those other risks that we saw around data being used by marketing companies without permission and also used by governments without permission. And so what do these findings tell us? Well, artificial intelligence and the use of personal data are clearly very polarizing topics, and with certain demographics, we see that there are very high levels of skepticism. These technologies may be seen by vulnerable groups as perpetuating inequality and reinforcing discriminatory power structures, and essentially causing them more harm than good. what we've seen with other areas of the World Risk Poll is that that perception of risk can also cause harm in itself, because essentially these individuals are then excluding themselves from using these technologies and excluding themselves from the potential benefits that these technologies can bring in terms of social, economic opportunity. And so to address these risks, it's very clear that policymakers, businesses, and digital innovators need to work to construct, to develop, and regulate these technologies in ways that counter biases and rather than causing harm and amplifying biases. And it's also essential, and I think this is the really most important takeaway from today, particularly following the first session that we had led by Sense About Science this morning, that it's really essential that these actors work with vulnerable communities to give them confidence that they can use these technologies and programs in a way that's going to benefit them. And so my closing slide, just to encourage you to go and visit the World Risk Poll website. You can download our Digital World report and also the other two reports that I mentioned, the Changed World and also the Resilient World. If you're interested in disaster risk management, you will probably also want to have a look at our Interactive Resilience Index that enables you to look in a very granular way at the resilience of communities and individuals around the world. You can also download the full data set, and so the data set on artificial intelligence and misuse of personal information has just been added to the website within the last couple of days, so we encourage researchers to use that. The information is freely available. And if you have a really good idea for the way in which the World Risk Poll data can be used to influence the safety of vulnerable communities around the world on the ground, then please do get in touch, because we've also got a funding call that's open at the moment for £2.25 million, and we're encouraging applications, encouraging proposals for projects that will help to turn the World Risk Poll into action. And the final thing to mention, these beautiful visual snapshots. On the right here, the key questions about perceptions of harm for artificial intelligence and misuse of personal data. The one for China shown up there. We've got them for each of the countries that were polled, so you can download those and see how the responses might have differed from the global average in the country that you might be particularly interested in. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating, Sarah. Thank you very much for that. I mean, so as we can see from that, the world is pretty much split on its views whether AI will mostly help or harm. What's your answer? What do you think?
That is a great question. The more time you spend on a question like that, I think it's obvious the answer is it will neither help nor harm. It will do both, because it's an extremely complex technology, set of technologies. And so I'm delighted that this research was done. I think it shows a lot of messages that people have been theorizing about or believing would be the case, but we couldn't evidence before. And we're going to go into that, but I want more, because I'm a greedy researcher and I want to see all of this extra data. Which particular risks? How will they play out? What are people concerned about? I think the survey question was around machines and robots that think and make decisions on their own. That specifies both the physicality of the technology, where we know most of artificial intelligence is in computer systems that are mostly hidden from us, and it also emphasizes the autonomy, whereas I think there is a very promising trend in AI design to move to human-centric, where these are tools that assist people rather than do things on their own. So there is a very wide range of AI applications, but I think we are getting it wrong. I think the evidence shows that the world is very divided and people are very concerned, both not just because of stories and narratives of AI that they have in their mind that might cause them to fear what might happen, though I think that's a big picture, and I think we will touch on that, but also investigative journalists and legal cases are showing us that AI is already harming people, and whether you think you will be on the benefiting side or the side that is harmed very much depends on where you are in the world, both in which country you are and what your position in your society. So I think we should delve into all of this complexity over this session.
Aidan, what's your opinion?
I mean, I completely agree with Shaha. I mean, when you find polling data, particularly towards technology, when kind of the attitude is split, in this case, in thirds between benefit, harm, and don't know, it shows exactly that the answer is that these technologies don't have the potential to do one or the other. They have huge potential to do both, and people really recognize that. And my hunch is the reason it's split so much is because most people are going through a little bit of that thought process, going, well, it might be good for medicine, it might be bad for data protection, it might be good for new scientific research, it might be bad for surveillance, so I don't know, and then kind of landing somewhere around the middle. So I completely agree that kind of then diving into, well, what are the particular risks, what are the particular benefits that people see is really interesting. The other thing I would maybe add, or two brief things I would maybe add is, Sarah, at the start of your talk, you mentioned how kind of with other technologies, genetically modified crops, nuclear power, whatever it is, you can kind of see how public support, trust in, acceptance of these technologies tracks quite well with how well those technologies are rolled out, how successful they are. And I think sometimes that's seen, public trust, therefore, is seen as a barrier to having technologies be successful. I think that's partly true, but I think another really important part of it is that public trust, public acceptance, public attitudes are a signal for what is or isn't working when it comes to technology. And with AI in particular, what we're seeing not work is that the benefits and the harms are disproportionately distributed. And I think that second or third chart you showed of the world where certain countries are very green in terms of positivity and certain countries were not so, I think that probably reflects where people feel the benefits are going to be felt and the harms are going to be felt around the world. There's a sort of a sci-fi author and technology essayist called Cory Doctorow, and he has this concept of the bad technology curve. He uses a much stronger word than that, but I'm going to be polite, where he basically says that exact thing, that if you want to look at where the harms of technology are going to fall, look at where the most disadvantaged communities already are, and that's where you'll see the harms of technology. If you want to see where the benefits are going to be felt, look at where the most privileged communities already are, and that's where you'll see the benefits. And so I think we stand at a bit of a precipice with AI and data-driven technology, that it could go either way, and I think a lot of work is needed to make sure it goes such that these technologies benefit the people that most need it and not disadvantage them.
I mean, that's really, really interesting, but what about, so if you're basing this perhaps on familiarity with technology, when you look at people in Eastern Asia, they're so much more positive about it than people in the USA, and I wonder why that is.
I think I'll take a stab and then pass it over to Aidan.
Yeah.
So that's...
Here comes the water.
Here comes the water. So I want to first acknowledge the fact that of the background narratives that are driving this. And this is not avoidable because we saw 2 slides back, a white robot providing assistance. Of course, this is not what the technology looks like. But this is how we imagine it, because it's very hard for us to imagine technology not through embodiment. In fact, the visionaries of artificial intelligence go way, way back, and are very different in different parts of the world and in different communities and different cultures. But I want to set that aside and look at people's experience with technology and people's experience of regulation of the technology. So we can think of a model of this technology or any technology as the people who develop it, the people who use it, the people who are affected by it but are not the users of it, and are really the people who's in charge of regulating it. And I think if you look at East Asia, if you look at North Europe, there is a sense in which they are both drivers of the technology. They are developing their homegrown models. They are using AI to solve problems in the society. But also, I think there's quite a lot of trust that there is regulatory attention to the problem. It is fairly sophisticated, and it listens to the citizenry. This is against the backdrop of various imaginaries of the technology that either help or hinder, which in the East Asia case are very positive, arguably much more positive than in Western, more individualistic societies. But that's a very significant simplification. I think that the Global AI Narrative Project would kind of take me to task for not appreciating the complexity of the narrative aspect of things. But from the experience, I think if you are in Northern Europe, you see the EU AI Act coming. You see long-term consultation. You see journalists and politicians talking about kind of the threat of this technology coming from the US, affecting communities, and how we need a society-wide conversation about how to get it right. Similar things are happening in Japan South Korea and China, for them it is also, particularly I think South Korea and China, coupled with significant technological growth. So you're seeing the benefits very strongly. If you compare that to the US, that is also very much at the forefront of driving the technology, there is a sense in which this is coming from Silicon Valley, and they are being allowed to do this to the rest of us, where the government is more stepping back, maybe driving some industry-wide conversations, but not really representing societal concerns and kind of really striking back against regulation, because there's a notion of freedom of innovation. I think the US result in the poll is the most striking to me. The fact that attitudes in North America, who are at the forefront of AI innovation, are the same as Latin America, and not much better than parts of Africa, which, I mean, those results for Latin America and Africa are very easy to explain, right? These are people who will have AI applied to them, right? They will not be the beneficiaries, they will not be the champions. There are exceptions to that, and I think people are acknowledging that this needs to be done. There is so much underlying infrastructure in terms of education, in terms of material technologies, data centers, in terms of good governance, in terms of data management that is required to be an AI innovation hub, that I can see why the Global South will feel like AI will be done to them and they will mostly be harmed by it. But for North America to have a similar experience is really, I think, a failure of regulation. And that's a very powerful story that we can now point to.
Just before you leap in on this, I just wanted to ask Sarah something, looking at China specifically, because of course, when you look at what's happening there politically at the moment, that might suggest that those results are no longer the case.
Yeah, and this question that we ask about perception of risk about artificial intelligence is one of our pulse questions. So we asked it in 2019, we asked in 2021. We didn't see a huge amount of change in terms of the global statistics. There were some areas that were more positive, most notably Europe. You mentioned the Act, previously, and we think that's probably why. It's going to be fascinating to follow up with that question again in 2023, if we're allowed to ask it, because there is a certain amount of censorship that happens with the poll questions in certain countries around the world. If we're allowed to ask it again, it'll be fascinating to see whether it's changed. Can I just mention one other thing? I don't know whether you were going to bring in the results from the poll about religion in your response to this question, but I didn't mention during my presentation, but a lot of people in North America answer to the question that Gallup posed about whether religion is an important part of daily life. They answer positively. And we see a correlation between the response to that question and whether people will think that AI will help or harm. So the more religious an individual is, the higher proportion of people saying yes to that question about religiosity, they also say that they feel that artificial intelligence will harm. America is also, I think, fourth in the world in terms of their experience of discrimination. So I think 46% of people who live in America have experienced some form of discrimination. So that's also going to be a driver of perceptions in North America as well.
Fascinating. Aidan.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of thoughts going on in my head because this is really interesting hearing both of your perspectives on this. I mean, I think the thing I would add is to your original question around familiarity and kind of understanding of AI. And this point on kind of religion, attitudes to so AI is complex, and I think there are however many people in this room, if you asked each of us, we would give a slightly different take on what we think artificial intelligence is, what we think technology is. So already there's going to be such different set of perspectives of what we think this technology is and how we think it will impact upon us and upon society. And all of that is influenced by who we are as people. So yeah, our religion, our socioeconomic background. I mean, I'm giving you the basics of social science here, which you probably are all very familiar with. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that when it comes to sort of the question of familiarity and understanding of AI, all of that gets wrapped into it as well. And it's this question of, so something that came up in one of the talks this morning around people's understanding of science is kind of a crucial thing that we need to overcome. And there are different levels of understanding of science around the world, and that tracks with things like education level, socioeconomic status, and so on. I think what's really important to remember is that we shouldn't confuse understanding or familiarity with something like AI with kind of acceptance of it or lack of nuanced attitudes towards it. So just because someone doesn't feel like they have a good understanding or good familiarity of it doesn't necessarily mean that they that's why they're negative about it, if that makes sense. So it could be something deeper than that. It could be around how much we feel we're going to be able to shape the way this technology affects us, how much we feel we're going to be able to control how much data goes in or out of our pockets. And that's wrapped up with pockets. I mean, our smartphones are in our pockets. I think that controls very much how people feel they're going to be affected by these technologies. So just because they're not familiar with it or don't understand it, I think, sometimes gets given too much weight in this debate around how people feel about AI, because a lot of it comes down to actually how they're going to be affected by it. And it's much more complex than I don't understand it, therefore I don't have an opinion. It's much more nuanced than that.
I think we're probably all much more familiar with personal data and the misuse of personal data. And now, when we're so far into the internet age, this is still clearly a huge concern. Why are we getting it so wrong? Where are we going wrong?
Would you like to go first?
Yeah. So I mean, so I found the findings that around sort of two-thirds, three-quarters of people around the world are concerned about their personal data being hacked or used by marketing companies or governments in ways they're not comfortable with. In a global poll, to find 75% odd of people concerned about something is huge. So I think the fact, I just first of all wanted to highlight that I think that's a really staggering finding. And it shows the level of concern that's out there around personal data that we all have. And I think that's because people recognize that although data and technology are sometimes abstract things. I mean, this morning we've been talking about flood risk and heat waves and climate change, this very real, present danger. AI and data can seem a little bit abstract, but I think people are really aware of the very real harms that come from discrimination, that come from surveillance through digital technology, that come from the increased concentration of power in the hands of a handful of companies, organizations, governments, in terms of their ability to shape our lives and wider society. So people, I think, are really waking up to the very real harms that can come from kind of the increasingly datafied society in which we live. And I don't know what we do about that, but I think it shows that until something comes along that can better regulate the kind of digital society, the digital infrastructure in which now kind of pervades the entire world and almost every society around the planet, until people are given more kind of confidence that data will be used in their best interests and in society's best interests and not in the best interests of corporate actors and shareholders. And until we have that, which we don't yet have, there are lots of good work going on around the world to try and create a better ecosystem. Until we have that, there will still be huge concern about the way digital technology influences our lives, and people will continue relying on it because they have to, but they will do so reluctantly and with great resignation about the fact that it might not be in their best interests to rely on these technologies despite the need to.
Sarah, why does the experience of discrimination seem to impact both people that worry about personal data and AI?
Well, if I'm honest, we don't know the answer to that question. It's one of the things that it would be very interesting to follow up with some further research. We quite often get these signals from the World Risk Poll, where we understand that there clearly is a correlation, but we don't understand why. I think you can, I was thinking about this morning in terms of artificial intelligence, and actually if you've experienced discrimination, as I mentioned in the slides, it galvanizes opinion. It's different, actually. People's reaction is different, to that question about mistrust of data. So there's something different happening there. And again, we don't know which technologies people are thinking about. So this is one of the areas where you want to ask more questions, and in the next poll you want to go into deeper levels of granularity. I think the hardest job I have at the foundation is actually deciding which questions to include on the poll, because there's a huge pressure for space, and you really want to drive impact out of the data that you collect. I just encourage anybody with an interest in this to conduct some further research to help us all understand in a bit more detail.
Yeah. In a moment we're going to come to you, both online and in the room, for your questions. But before that, just back to this idea of regulation, really, and what can be done. Sarah's presentation concluded by highlighting the need to develop and to regulate AI and other data-driven technologies in an equitable way that reduces rather than amplifies discriminatory bias, also in a way that protects at-risk groups, enhances trust, and so on. But how do you do that in practice?
It's both an easy and a difficult question. I'll highlight it. There are some things that we know we need to do. It's just very hard to do them. I think Aidan can go into much greater depth in the complexities of how you engage communities, run citizen juries, and so on. But from the perspective of a developer, these are time-consuming, unpredictable, may significantly alter the way you're going to develop your product. Doesn't affect your margins very much because those communities are not the ones from whom you're making your profit. And your competitors are going to get to market faster if you insist on doing this and they don't. So there is a race to the bottom, which is why, even though we see very large companies expressing interest in engaging marginalized communities, having various ethics principles that say that they don't want to, that they want fairness and they don't want to amplify existing biases and so on, we're seeing very few cases where this is translated into actual practice. And where it is translated into actual practice and companies do take the hit on doing things more slowly and studiously, they realize that it's hard to do and those projects have a high failure rate. And their competitors go to market faster and put out a product that amplifies people's experience of being harmed and discriminated against by these technologies. So an enlightened regulator will come in and say there needs to be a floor that everyone needs to meet, backed by legislation. In the US, it might go more via taking companies to court and creating expectations in that way. It is not ideal, particularly if you think about access to justice and law by these marginalized groups. I think the EU is trying to address it through the EU AI Act, but there's a lot of questions about how that will go through in practice. It'll have to go through the member states. I think there are visions of a much more democratized, decentralized way of developing the technology, whereby communities can teach themselves, own the technology, get to the point where they develop for themselves to mitigate all of those biases, or are hired into these very large companies and are active participants in the process of development. There are very large barriers for that happening as well, whether it's the kind of very large capital intensity required to develop new AI products, and the fact you need a lot of data that small communities may not have access to. So we know what the solutions might look like. It is very hard to get them in practice.
Well, I mean, what are some examples of good practice, of best practice in this?
Around kind of data and AI, I mean, it's a great question. They are still emerging, which is my kind of optimistic way of saying they're few and far between. I think one of the things we have to remember is that we're talking about a relatively nascent industry and ecosystem. So yes, we've had kind of data protection law for several years now, and the idea of kind of information law goes back further than that. AI law is non-existent. I mean, until, yes, AI has been a concept that researchers and scientists have been talking about since the late 50s, but until the last decade or so, we haven't really seen it emerging into kind of across society in the way that we see today. So I think we have to remember that we're at very early days when it comes to sort of good regulatory or good governance practice around these technologies. One thing I would say is that this morning we heard about aviation industry quite a lot, and I think we can look at industries like the aviation industry or like the food standards industry, and I'm going to give a bit of a TLDR version of a comment piece I wrote for the World Risk Poll website, which draws on kind of those ecosystems that exist for food standards and aviation standards. You know, all of us could go and buy a sandwich from a supermarket nearby here or hop onto a plane and not have to worry too much about the safety of those things, because we know there's a regulatory ecosystem that exists that includes standards and includes laws and includes auditing and governance bodies, and it's huge kind of machinery of governance that exists for those ecosystems. And it's not been perfect or plain sailing, and we heard this morning about how you know, it's been through, unfortunately, disasters that the aviation industry has gotten to the level of regulation and safety that it has today. My, I guess, hope would be that we don't have to go through the same number of disasters to get to a successful AI and data regulatory ecosystem. But I think the point is that we have to look at these other ecosystems that exist for really complex things, and try and see how we can port the best of that: standards, regulation, auditing, governance, public participation, all of these things that need to play a part in creating a kind of strong regulatory and governance ecosystem. And that has to be done on a national scale and on an international scale. So it's no small task, but I think there are lots of good people working on it, and there's lots of good movement happening in academia and civil society and governments around the world to try and get this built.
I mean, yeah, exactly as we heard this morning, you know, learn from other people's mistakes.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, well, do we have some questions from the audience? If you do, if you could just wait for either, I think it's Emily and Christine have the microphones, and if you could just give them a wave. I can't really see because of the lights, so we have somebody right there. Christine, just give her a wave. There we go.
You. May I have two questions, potentially? First is probably for Sarah, and that's about correlation and causation. So you've made it clear that, of course, the World Risk Poll pulls up all these fascinating correlations. The example in the States of religious groups and AI is a really great one. What responsibility do we as a foundation and other stakeholders in this space have in navigating the distinction between causation and correlation, and how helpful is it, given that we can't explain the whys of these correlations, to put them out there? That's my first question. And the second, if we've got time, and it's fine if not, is about, given that, you know, a third of the world shows this concern, or half the world, around AI, which is absolutely alarming, what structures do we have for for supporting individuals' safety and risk in this space? And I'm thinking here of an article I read probably 10, 15 years ago about the future of labour unions being less about what they traditionally have done and being more about protecting workers' data and so on and so forth. So one example might be unions, but as curious as to your thoughts on what other than legislation, what sort of bodies we have who could lead in this space. Thank you.
Thank you. Shahar, do you want to take that last question?
I'm happy to take the second one.
Yeah.
I think as we've been through a phase with climate about thinking about individual action, the case here is also not going to be so much on individual actions because AI development is extremely centralized. Most of the data sits with relatively few companies. Most of the computing hardware required to create the most advanced models sits with very few companies. It's hard to count more than 12 across the US and China. And so you need a lot of power to be able to curtail the behaviors of those actors. Part of it, I think, has to be government, but it can't be government alone. And so I think civil society, industry groups, like the Partnership on AI, a little bit of hope for international fora where some of these discussions are happening. OECD are doing some promising work in this space. The UN might end up doing some promising work in this space. And I think in all of these fora, it will be very important to amplify the voices of communities who have been affected by these technologies, because through self-selection, and not just through self-selection, they are not the ones developing these technologies, and so they are underrepresented in the people, in those 12 companies who are developing these technologies and bringing it to market, and arguably in the governments that are meant to regulate them. But I think it will be very high-power entities creating a balance against very high-power entities, not individuals who are making the change.
Thank you. Sarah, the question about correlation and causation and responsibility.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. I think we do have a responsibility. And in fact, we've just kicked off a project looking at leading indicators of safety within occupational health and safety. Leading indicators are quite often used by companies within their management systems as a way to consider which factors are having an impact on their safety outcomes. But the research that the Foundation has done has indicated that actually there isn't a good evidence base for leading indicators, or certainly not a published one, and it's something that we've just commissioned the Thomas Aston Institute at the University of Manchester to look at for us. I just want to say a little bit about the difference between correlation and causation there, for those of you who may not be familiar. So if you think about global temperatures, the rise in global sea temperatures over the last few years. At the same time, we've also seen a decrease in incidence of piracy. Now, does that mean that because the water is getting warmer, we don't see as many pirates at sea? No. If we did, that would be causation, That's just simply a correlation that those two things are happening at the same time. So the point about leading indicators within occupational health and safety is that if you don't set up essentially a small experiment, it doesn't have to be very complex, to actually make sure that you do understand whether your change is actually causing something to happen or whether you're just measuring two things that happen to be moving at the same time, you can't be certain that actually the action that you're taking is causing something to happen. So yes, Olivia, I think we absolutely do have a responsibility there, and it's something that we're actively looking at.
More questions from the floor. Again, I can't really see. So we have one here. The microphone's just coming to you now. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I have a question about the change perception of people of risk. So if there is an accident or there is a big international situation, people have it in front of them in the news, they're worried about it, then 3 months later, something else takes priority. So what I wanted to ask, Sarah, is how do you factor out this change perception of individuals, which is a very personal thing we all experience in our lives, right? When you do these polls, because you're sampling at a given moment in time with a particular international context. Thank you.
I mean, a good example is COVID. When we polled in 2021, the Delta variant of COVID was surging and receding in countries around the world. And we do see an impact on the data. And so our Change World report comes with information about exactly when the poll was undertaken, so that when people looking at that data for 2021 think, well, that's a bit of an odd result. I wouldn't have thought that, people would have responded in that way, they can understand the wider context that was happening within that individual country. So absolutely, it is an issue. But as I said earlier, at the global level, these things tend to counter themselves out.
And back to the floor, and do remember, if you are tuning into us online, then you can ask your questions through that portal. And I think Beth's got some online questions.
You. We've had a question in about bias. So I think, Sarah, one of your slides mentioned this. So the question is, how do we limit or eliminate bias in artificial intelligence, which can have significant unintended consequences?
I'm happy to pick up on that. So for clarity, I'm not an AI specialist, but the reason that we see so much kind of unfortunately bias and discrimination perpetuated through AI systems is that the way they are designed is essentially they're trained on data about the past. So if you train your data set on existing on data about existing things which are already biased or discriminatory, then all the AI will do is reflect that bias and discrimination back to you. So we've seen really awful examples of this, for example, where certain AI algorithms for facial recognition, for example, have only been trained on, for example, people that have white faces. And so when you then apply that facial recognition algorithm to people who are people of color, then the AI system will not work for that. When you then deploy that system into a setting where there's already bias and discrimination, such as, say, policing in the United States, you then have an AI system which will inadvertently cause to the arrest of black American men, and this has happened wrongfully because the AI system says, yes, that's the man that committed the crime, when it actually is not at all. It's just the AI system is not very good at recognizing people of color. So that's one example of how AI systems kind of take in bias data and then just give out and amplify bias and discrimination. One answer to how you solve that is you train the system better, and I think most AI labs around the world now should be working double or triple time to make sure that the data sets they're using to train their AI algorithms are not biased, are better reflections of society. The more complex answer, I think, is about recognizing a much more kind of wishy-washy grey fact that the AI systems do not operate outside of society. They are part of society, they're part of socio-technical systems, and we need to try and address bias and discrimination in that whole socio-technical system to ensure that one tool, the AI tool that sits within it, does not continue to perpetuate and rectify it. So yes, AI developers should be training their systems better, but I think those that are deploying AI systems, that are buying them, that are using them, need to think about how might this AI system amplify existing biases or discrimination in the setting that I work in, whether it's a hospital or a police force or a government body or whatever it is, because it's that inability to think through how might this be perpetuating existing biases that causes lots of problems in the past.
Thank you. Give us a wave. Yeah, we have one over there.
Thank you. I've got a question for Sarah. Two questions, actually. I was really struck by I think the relative negativity, and I think it was Eastern and Southern Africa, to AI. And I found myself thinking, to what degree, if you were trying to reach vulnerable communities, the survey would have to train enumerators to translate the word AI into, say, Swahili. It could be that some translations have particularly negative connotations culturally, whether you factor that in. And then this whole question of what do people associate with AI? For instance, is there a big overlap with social media and some of the underlying algorithms that people feel are applied on them? And social media, may be negatively perceived in some of those territories, and local media much more trusted. Whereas in East Asia, China, for instance, social media may be perceived to be an outlet for freedom of expression. So on those two issues of translation of the surveys and where does social media sit in the associations of the surveyed in terms of AI, would be great to have your feedback on.
Thank you. So on the first question around translation, I mentioned that we're just setting the questions for the 2023 poll, and our deadline for that's coming up the end of this month. I think it won't be until March next year that Gallup actually go into the field with the questions, and that's because most of that time is taken up with translation. And so they have teams around the world that they work with to make sure that actually cognitively what they're asking is the same in different languages around the world. And so it's one of the reasons that we contract Gallup, who are experts in international polling, to do this work for us, so that actually we can be sure that when we get the data through, that people have interpreted the question in the same way. That said, in terms of where social media sits, I mean, we've all talked about and recognised the fact that actually when you talk about artificial intelligence to people, they will be thinking about different things. So we simply don't know. But again, you're absolutely right. It's going to have an impact on people's responses to that question in different places around the world. Their cultural context is going to impact on how they answer.
We've probably got time for one or possibly two more. And we have one up there. The microphone's just coming to you from that side. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Charles from University of Westminster. I'm specializing in cross-cultural research, so I have one question. By the way, thank you very much for downloading the data. I just had a look at the data. And I wondered, most of the questions in the questionnaire, in terms of the measurement, you use a categorical yes or no answer. And for me, because I plan to use your data actually to develop research project, and that gives a lot of limitation in terms of especially earlier we talk about causality, causal model prediction. And I wonder, maybe is it a bit challenging because you got so many countries, the whole world, and whether that might be a potential difficulty. I wonder whether in the future that could be using kind of a like a scale interval measurement, then we can make the maximum use of the data to possibly produce some predictive models. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I mean, it's great to hear that you're interested in using the data. I'm very happy to have a conversation afterwards about that. It's a question of space, that if you use something like the Leica scale, it can take a minute to ask a question that otherwise would take you perhaps 20 seconds. And then obviously if you're asking a question that's taken 20 seconds, you can do 5 of those within a minute. And you get 5 answers that may not be quite as good as they would have been if they'd have been on the Leica scale, but at least we get the coverage. So it is a balance. Some of our questions do have a much more granular response, but those are the ones that we're really investing in heavily in terms of the amount of time that they take up on the poll.
Yeah, just here, and I think that will be our last question. Just give Emily a wave. There we go.
Thanks, Emily. Good morning, everyone. It's Catalina Jaime from the Climate Center. So, Shahar, the name of the center is like quite a thing, no? What are the existential risks that you study within AI? No, because we have talked about the risk in general, but what is what you are more worried about?
Thank you for that question. So, when I give talks about AI risk, I mean, I like to break them down, and I like to break them down into now risks, things that people are experiencing now, and I think this is mostly what's coming through the survey, is the now risks plus whatever narratives that are in the kind of drinking water for the particular country or society. There are soon risks, which is technologies that we kind of know will be coming, but are not quite there yet. There isn't the kind of product market fit, if you will. And then there's the long-term risks that we have no, science does not preclude those technologies from existing, though we have no idea when they will come. There are some things that worry us on the soon category. Use of AI in weapon systems, use of AI in very large-scale surveillance, use of AI in rendering common information systems basically unusable. So everyone has their own version of the truth that they carry around with them, and it's different from everyone else's version of the truth. And then I think we're partway towards maybe solving some of these problems, so they are very hard, and they make other problems like climate change harder. If you can't agree on what reality is, you can't agree that the world is burning around you. But then longer term, science does not preclude AI systems that are better at solving problems than either any human individually or all of humanity collectively. If you have a system like that, it is by definition not controllable. If that system is not trying to do things in the world that you want it to do, by definition you would not be able to stop it. And this feels very sci-fi, maybe less now than 5 years ago or 10 years ago when people were talking about these scenarios, but it will be very hard now to shut down the internet. Broadly, we benefit from it. But if something happened to the internet such that it drove all of us insane, it will still be very hard to shut down. AI is a much more pervasive and multifaceted technology that is probably going to pervade much more of life than the internet currently does. So that's the shape of the argument of the risks we worry about.
So much more to go into. And I hope that during lunch, which is coming up shortly, you'll be able to talk to each other and to our panelists, Sarah, also Aidan and Shahar. Do race back here, please, for 1:45. We'll be live streaming from Brazil, and apparently there'll be circus tricks and a scavenger hunt. So I'm not quite sure what to expect, but if you're back here in an hour, we'll all find out together. Thank you.